Okay, so just then we were talking about the way the diesel combustion works in reality when we talk about common rail systems and the various issues. Here, we want to talk about why pilot injection has to be, or why we have to have pilot injection. So when we were talking about the fuel going inside the cylinder, what we're actually doing, obviously, like we said, we're inserting a thermal mass inside that cylinder. So what happens is as the compression comes up, we're generating a lot of extra heat, which is the catalyst that makes the fuel reach the flash point. Now, as we were talking before, the smaller the particle, the smaller the thermal mass, the faster it can absorb that heat and the faster it can burn off. But when we're talking about common rail, we're actually dumping a lot of fuel per degree. Now, we know that we can put in a lot of fuel in a very short amount of duration, put it in after TDC, and actually make really good horsepower for no problem. So, obviously, if we know that now, why can't we backwards configure that into older injection systems? And the answer is actually really, really simple. The problem that we have is that we only have a certain amount of compression. We only have a certain amount of heat. And there's always going to be ignition delay when we inject fuel inside the cylinder. That's just a fact of life. But what happens is when we dump too much fuel in per degree. So let's say, for example, we've got 5 degrees of ignition delay, and that's a fact we're going to have to live with. When we insert the amount of fuel, if we put in half a cc over those 5 degrees, there's not a lot of thermal mass there, so we know the residual heat inside the cylinder will absorb all of that and go for it. But if I inject 10 cc's of fuel over those 5 degrees, there's actually a hell of a lot of thermal mass that I've just put inside that cylinder that has not heated up. So what happens is it actually absorbs that heat, and then it means the ignition delay is made worse. So we have a compounding of problems here. One, we have the more fuel per degree, the more energy or the more heat that it's absorbed before it'll get to flash point, because there's more absorption material in there. There's more thermal mass for it to absorb into. But then the next part is, so obviously the ignition delay is going to be eked out. So now we've got more fuel per degree that's absorbing more heat that's going to take a longer time, which means there's even more fuel inside that cylinder again. So we've actually got a lot of potential energy inside that cylinder. So what ends up happening, this is a cylinder pressure. What ends up happening is once it actually goes bang, it goes off with a hell of a bang because there's a lot of fuel inside that cylinder now. And this is why we could never do it before, because you would always get this horrendous knocking inside the engine. It was, so say, okay, but the problem was there was that much fuel because there was that much ignition delay that when it finally went, it went off with a hell of a bang. And we get this problem here. So now what they have to do with common rail is they have to put a pilot injection in. And essentially, pilot injection in many cases is around, many cases they'll actually do 2 pilot injections. There'll be one around 60 or 55 degrees advanced, and there'll be another one at about 30. Both of those will traditionally or generally speaking be burnt off by the time 15 degrees before top dead center comes around. So what's actually happening is we put 2 little amounts of fuel as the cylinder's coming up. Both of those amounts of fuel have burnt off, and it's created a much hotter environment inside that cylinder. All we want to do is stop when we put that fuel in and that thermal mass is that it doesn't drop it below the flash point of the diesel. So the pilot injection will always be precisely metered. It'll always be enough in order to make sure that no matter what we dump inside that cylinder, it's going to burn it off. But essentially, it's there to make sure that when we do get the fuel and it does come in, sure, we're always going to get a little bit of a first stage combustion because we've always got that ignition delay, whether it be 2, 3, 5 degrees advanced of delay, but there's always going to be that little bit of fuel, but it's not going to be a massive delay and it's not going to be a massive amount of fuel that's all going to burn off at once. So this is why we have pre-injection, and that's the difference between those two. So I hope you guys have found that interesting.